Welcome to Sunday School for December 20th, 2020. It is our penultimate Sunday School, our second to last. That's what that word means, Sunday School. Today we're going to continue in our series on the Ten Commandments. We're covering commandments number 7 and 8 in our fourth installment on the Ten Commandments in our Old Testament survey. So today we'll be covering those. We're happy to have you with us. Let's jump into it. Okay, so this morning we're continuing our series on the Decalogue. We're in Exodus chapter 20, verses 14 and 15. I only have to read 9 total words for these two commandments. And here they are. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. Short 9 words of commandments, but a lot to unpack there. Before we jump into the 7th commandment on adultery, I want to say very quickly that one of the things we always need to keep in mind when we study the commandments is that God tells us who He is before He tells us what to do. He tells us who He is and what we are before He tells us what we should believe or what we should do or how we should act or what we should say. In other words, the way that some people describe that is the indicative always precedes the imperative. In other words, an indicative is who you are or who God is, and the imperative is what God's going to do or what God wants you to do. So, and we always need to remember that. Anyway, let's jump to the 7th commandment. What is adultery? What is adultery? Well, the word adultery, or the word to adulterate, the definition is to render something poorer in quality by adding another substance. So, if you think about it in this context, you have like pure sugar or pure maple syrup or pure unadulterated maple syrup. These are things that are, or pure unadulterated water. They have no additives. There's nothing extra in this thing. It is unadulterated. There's no third substance or extra substance. If you look at the back of, pretty much anything you eat, you're going to see that there are a lot of substances in there that you might not realize. A lot of phosphates and carbonates and I don't know whatever else, magnesium sulfates, and these are different things that help preserve the food. But they also mean that what you're eating is not pure. It's not strictly just the one thing you're eating. It's not just chocolate syrup or it's not just vanilla ice cream. There's other things in there as well. In the context of marriage, to add a third substance would be to add a third person, right? The addition of another person which renders the original construction of lower quality, right? And it's important for us to realize that the people who received this commandment would have known immediately what that meant. In fact, you can see that because the commandments are so brief, right? They knew what it meant to steal. They knew what it meant to commit adultery. They knew what it meant to murder. They knew what it meant to bear false witness. They understood what that meant immediately. They didn't have to have it explained to them what adultery meant. And this goes along with what God has already taught us in His Word in the Old Testament about marriage. I'm going to read to you Genesis 2:24. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." So very early on, that's Genesis 2, God establishes that marriage is between one man and one woman, and that it is for life. And again, Jesus reiterates that in Mark chapter 10, verses 7 and 9, when He says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate." So clearly, the Bible's teaching on marriage is clear. It's one man and one woman for life. Right? That is what marriage is. The Bible defines marriage that way, and there's no other biblical definition of marriage than that. So the idea of adultery is a breaking of that covenant between a husband and a wife, between two spouses, a breaking of that covenant and entering into a relationship with someone else besides your spouse. So that should be kind of obvious. Now, and the people who received this commandment knew what that meant. But like us, the Old Testament, the Israelites, they would take a rule, one of God's rules, and they do this with all of God's rules. They would take God's rule, and then they would try to find ways to run up against the edge of it without technically breaking it. And so some questions that we would naturally ask ourselves if we're reading our Bible are, okay, if that's true, if God forbids adultery, what about polygamy? Now, we've talked about polygamy before in our Old Testament survey. We've already discussed this multiple times. Polygamy is not technically adultery. It's not technically adultery because it's marrying more than one person. And in the case in the Bible, it would be one man who married two wives. And we see this in the Scriptures multiple times. We see it with Jacob and his multiple wives. We see it before then. We see it in several places. And it's important for us to note that while polygamy occurs in the Bible, it is never praised or condoned or exalted by God. And any time that it does occur, it always produces a huge amount of brokenness. But this is a classic example of God's people taking God's rule and then trying to find a way to kind of like do an end run around what God wants them to do. They're going to take matters into their own hands, and they may have nefarious purposes or sinful purposes, or it may be like practical purposes. I'm sure someone would say, well, it's not right for me to just have one wife because, we've got to have more children, so I need to have multiple wives to have. It's just practical for me to do that at this time. But I want you to see in the Scriptures that God never condones, or He never shows polygamy in a positive light. Okay, the second way in which the Israelites would try to toe the line and bend but not break this commandment is through divorce. A man might decide that he likes another woman besides his wife, and so in order to not commit adultery, he would divorce his wife and then marry this new woman, right? That way he is, according to the law, or technically, he has not committed adultery. And this is a real problem even in Jesus' day, where women were being left and the husband was getting away with it, I guess, legally because he was not committing adultery because he was just divorcing his wife. Now, the Scriptures lay out legitimate reasons why you might divorce someone. There are three of them basically, which is adultery, abandonment, and abuse. And abuse is really just two, but abuse falls under abandonment. So they all start with A, so it's easy to remember. Adultery, which we're talking about today, abandonment, and abuse. These would be legitimate reasons why someone might divorce someone else in the Bible. But what I'm talking about now is not these scenarios. This is simply someone who decides they can't get along with their spouse anymore, and so they just decide, well, I'm just going to divorce them because I found someone else that I think I can get along with better. That is not a biblical reason for divorce. And Jesus even says in Luke 16:18, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. So Jesus is pretty clear on this, and the Old Testament is clear on this too. But what this shows us more than anything is it reveals in our hearts how we don't believe that God is good. We don't believe in His commandments. And so in order to stay in His good graces, what we do is we try to follow His rule the least amount possible. We try to bend the rule as far as we can without breaking it. Now, Jesus speaks on divorce and specifically on this commandment in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:27 through 32. So I just want to let Him speak for Himself here. So I'm going to read that, Matthew chapter 5, beginning now. Verse 27 is where we start. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. It is also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. So, there you go. That's Matthew 5:27 through 32, Jesus is speaking to our hearts, not the letter of the law. He's speaking to people who legally or technically they had not violated this commandment. But this is so genius what Jesus does, all right? And Jesus' teaching is so radical, and this is one example where you can just see that Jesus cuts through all of the performative righteousness that people have, where they say, like, according to the letter of the law, I didn't follow. You've gotten in trouble, and you'll say, well, technically, Mom, I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you all of the truth. And we'll talk about lying next week when we get to bearing false witness. But it's that kind of idea. But Jesus cuts right to the heart of that when he says, it's not about the letter of the law. It is about your heart. And I want you to notice how genius this is, right? Because if you follow Jesus' teaching about committing adultery here, and you say it's not just about what you do, but it's even about what you think, and it's about lust, it's not about sex. Think about how that changes the way that we observe this rule, and also how it cuts through those technicalities, right? You ask the question, how far is too far when I'm dating someone, or how physically intimate can I be with someone? That question doesn't matter to Jesus. It's an irrelevant question to him. It's completely pointless. You say, you might ask, what counts as sex? What kind of physical activity counts as sex and what doesn't? Again, completely irrelevant to him, because Jesus says it is lust, not sex, that is the threshold for adultery. So what he says is, you can keep your performative law, Pharisees, and you can give your wife a divorce. But if you are married, if you're an Israelite this time, or even now, if you're married, and you decide you just don't like your wife anymore and you want to marry someone else, you can't do that without already having committed adultery by lusting in your heart. It doesn't matter what physical activity you've engaged in. Jesus has cut through all of the red tape. And this is what he does, which is so amazing. It's why he's the greatest teacher of all time. He's the Son of God. We shouldn't be surprised by that. Is that he cuts through all of our technicalities and he gets right to the heart issue. And the heart issue that we have here is that we are an unfaithful people. We're an unfaithful people who don't keep faith. We don't keep faith with each other, and we don't keep faith with God. And by exposing in this area of our life, right, by exposing in the connection between lust and adultery, Jesus shows us just how unfaithful we are. And more than that, what this commandment shows to us is that not only are we unfaithful to our spouses or our future spouses or whoever, because again, you can what's so genius about Jesus' teaching of this is that you can violate this commandment without ever having been married. Because again, he's not talking about our behavior, he's talking about what's happening in our hearts. By the way, and how does this commandment point us to Christ? What is the number one way in which God describes the sin of idolatry? And what's the metaphor that God uses, the first and primary metaphor that God uses when it comes to idolatry with his people, worshiping other gods besides him? It is the metaphor of adultery, right? That we are not faithful, that he is faithful to us, but we are not faithful to him, that we are the unfaithful spouse. He even goes so far as to have one of his prophets, Hosea, marry a prostitute, Gomer. This is what the book of Hosea is about. He tells him to marry a prostitute and to have children and marry this woman he knows won't be faithful to him, as a living example to the people of God of what God's relationship with his people is like, that he is the faithful husband and that they are the faithless bride. We run to other saviors all the time. But how this commandment points us to Christ is that Christ is always faithful to us. That he is always faithful, that he never loses faith with us. And this is why it's so important for us to recognize this. First of all, if you've committed this sin, and almost everyone I know has violated this commandment, and literally everyone has violated this commandment, just like everyone's violated every other commandment. One, you need to hear, and whether you violate it simply in your heart, or if you're an adult listening to this and you violate this commandment the way that we might normally understand it, in either way, that you can be forgiven. Right? Is that Jesus forgives murderers, thieves, adulterers, liars. Paul talks about the church in Corinth and he lists all these sins. And then in I think this is chapter 11, he says, or actually it's in chapter 6, he says, such were some of you, but you've been washed and you've been justified. So this sin is not greater than any other sin, right? But this sin is pervasive in our culture. And we need to see that our problem is not necessarily our lust as much as it is what's going on inside, what our lust reveals about our heart and about what we're trusting in versus what we're not trusting in, which would be God. This commandment speaks not only to people who are married, but also people who are unmarried. This commandment speaks against all forms of sexual immorality because, again, it's not about what you do, it's about what goes on in your heart. It speaks against pornography. It speaks against extramarital or premarital physical intimacy. It speaks against all those things. And this is the genius of Jesus and the genius of this commandment because it reveals to us that all of us are adulterers and that we all run after other gods and we are unfaithful, and what we need is a faithful Savior. Okay, well, what about the 8th commandment? You shall not steal. Now, this is probably the most well-known, even though it's number 8 on the list, this is probably the most well-known commandment. Exodus 20:15. In fact, I used to work at a church. When I was in seminary, I interned at a church, and they would just write Exodus 20:15 on all of their stuff. Like that they had in the youth office and they had everywhere. They would just write the verse Exodus 20:15, which is, you shall not steal. In other words, don't take this, whatever it is. Anything they had, they would just write Exodus 20:15. And when you ask someone, what are some of the commandments, what do they violate? Murder and stealing are going to be 2 of the things that are mentioned almost off the jump. Everyone understands what it means to steal. Well, what is stealing? Stealing is taking someone's property without his or her permission. That's like the dictionary definition of stealing. But it's not just physical property that can be stolen. So sometimes that's what we think about. I have a pencil and Shay steals my pencil from my office and she has it in her office. She stole my pencil, right? Or I steal her pen and from her office, or I steal her pair of scissors. And that's like stealing, right? I took something that didn't belong to me. And we're going to talk about that. But you can also take non-tangible things from people. You can steal things like time or honor or social standing from others. And it's important for us to recognize that anytime that we take anything for ours that isn't ours, that we're stealing. You can steal people's time. Let's say that you work at a job that pays you an hourly wage and you purposely goof off during work time, right? All right, you may say, well, that's just a harmless thing that everybody does, and that may in fact be true, that everyone does it. But you are still violating this commandment when you do that, because you have pledged to do one thing during this time and you're doing something else. The most obvious way in which many of you are going to be tempted to steal is that you cheat in school. Anytime that you pass anyone else's work off as your own work, that's stealing. You're stealing their honor, their standing, and also you're by asking people for their work, either by cheating on tests or homework or whatever. Again, you are not only are you violating this commandment by stealing, but you're bringing someone else into sin. So this directly relates to your horizontal relationships. Not only do you hurt someone when you take things from them, you also hurt someone when you ask them to be your co-conspirator. And this is an important thing you need to understand. This is one of God's top 10, Not that any of God's commandments are less important than the others, but God took a moment to say this. And we should not take it lightly. I think it's important to also recognize that some people will read the Bible and say that there should be no personal property, that Christians should own everything in common. That's one way in which you can read some verses in Acts. That's one interpretation, but I wouldn't say it's the best interpretation. But I would say that one of the things this commandment teaches us is that God respects personal property, right? That it's impossible to steal something if no one owns anything, right? So this is one thing. God understands that His people are going to own things, right? And that some people own more and some people own less, right? But to take someone else's property, honor, time, or standing without their permission is stealing. And we can't live together in community if we can't respect each other's property, each other's time, each other's standing. So it's important for us to recognize this. Because stealing, not only does it affect Well, we're going to talk about how it affects our relationship with God, but it affects our relationship with each other. I'll just tell you a story really quickly, is that I knew a guy, I'm obviously not going to name his name, but when we were in like 5th or 6th grade, he started coming over to my house to play, and I noticed, I didn't even notice because I was clueless kid, but my parents noticed that some things from my room started to go missing. They couldn't find certain things. And it turns out, now we never accused him of it, but things stopped going missing when this kid stopped coming over to play. And I just remember being so upset about it, because it just meant that that person wasn't really my friend, that they had violated my trust. And even as a young child, in 5th and 6th grade, I was angry and I was hurt, and I just looked at that person in a different light because they had done that, right? And some of that was judgmental, and I didn't know that that I still, the same. I mean, I don't want to make him out to be a bad guy and me a good guy, or in any way, shape, or form. But it did change the way I looked at them. And this commandment is important because if we can't love our neighbor as ourselves, it's impossible for us to do that if we're stealing from each other. Right? If we can't trust each other, then it's going to be hard for us to live together. Right? And this gets at the heart of, this is not so much about the act of stealing, whether you've shoplifted or whether you've taken something from someone, or whether you've cheated or whatever it is. It's about the heart. It's saying, I deserve this. And even though God has not given it to me and He's given it to someone else, I want it. And I'm going to take it for my own. And so not only does it affect our relationship with each other, but this commandment also reflects our relationship with God. Because when we steal, what we say is, I cannot trust God to take care of me. I've got to figure this thing out on my own. It doesn't matter what God has laid down as proper behavior or improper behavior. I know what I need, and God has not given it to me, and I've got to go and take it. Right? And it's also a reminder that the person that we steal from the most is not our neighbor. It's not the store. Is God. The person that we steal from constantly is we steal from God, because God owns everything. Everything we have and everything anyone else has been given to them by God. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Whatever talents you have, whatever material possessions you have, no matter what you have has been given to you from God. And so when we take other things from other people, or when we take their honor or their standing, or who we're really stealing from is not only them, but we're stealing from God. We're saying that it was wrong for God to give them this, whatever it is. Even if it's just like the ability to do math homework well. It was wrong for God to give him that ability, and I should have it, and so I'm going to take it. So let's think about how that affects our vertical relationship. How does stealing point us toward Christ? Well, I just want to remind you that Jesus Christ never stole anything, and that's not really a controversial thing to say. But I want you to remember that his entire life, certainly his entire earthly ministry, was a life of doing the exact opposite of stealing. Instead of taking what didn't belong to him, Jesus Christ's life was characterized by putting aside things that were rightfully his. Look in Philippians chapter 2. In Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, it says this. Paul is commanding the church in Philippi to have a certain attitude. And here's what it says. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So I want you to hear that Jesus had equality with God, and he didn't consider it something that he had to grab onto. That's not what he thought. That he didn't have to hold onto it and say, this is mine. Instead, he held it with an open hand. He held it with an open hand. In other words, he put it on the shelf. He took his rights, what he was due, and this is the exact opposite of stealing. Paul is using it to talk about humility, which is the exact, in other words, I am owed nothing. His attitude toward God and our attitude toward God should be, but Jesus Christ's attitude toward God was that God owes me nothing. That even my rights I will gladly give up for him. This is the opposite. This is the exact opposite mentality of someone who is taking something that doesn't belong to them. So just like every other commandment, even though this has direct implications for how we deal with each other, it also has important implications for how we view Jesus Christ. Okay, so what are our takeaways for today on the 7th and 8th commandment? The first one is this, is that our hearts matter more than our behavior. That what the law reveals, and what Jesus reveals about the law, is that the law reveals our hearts. That we may think about, and we've talked about this with the previous commandments, we may think that we are like technically observing this commandment, that we're technically, we've kept it. But what this reveals is that in our hearts we break the commandments all the time. That the commandments lay bare our hearts, and our hearts are what Jesus cares about. The second thing we learned is that it's possible to adulterate your marriage before you ever say I do. That because the threshold for adultery is not sexual activity but lust, that one, this commandment is being violated many times more than we might actually realize, and two is that this is not just a commandment for people who are married, it's a commandment for everyone. Thirdly, we learn that God gave us everything, that we owe everything to God, and the person we steal from the most is not other people, that the person we steal from the most is God. And lastly, and this is maybe the most important thing, one, Jesus is the faithful bridegroom. We do not keep faith with God, but Jesus always keeps faith. That He is faithful to us even when we are faithless to Him. And secondly, Jesus relinquished His rights in order to come and to live and to die for us. He didn't steal, He did the exact opposite. He took what was rightfully His and He set it on the shelf, and then He gives it to us. So those are our takeaways for today. Thanks for joining us. Again, you can join us in person. We're in the Frith this week. We're back in the Frith after a little time at Trinity Hall with the adults, and you can come and join us. And there's no fellowship tonight. We'll start fellowship again, or small groups this week. We'll start all that back after the holiday is over. I hope you have. The next time that we have Sunday school will be after Christmas, so I hope you have a Merry Christmas and a great time with your family, and look forward to seeing you